So we've talked about select type items where students pick the right answer out of the lineup. This is really what's called a recognition task. And it's a lot easier than a recall task in which the student has to generate all the answer options themselves. You should note that switching from one format to the other, even though the level of cognition or question is exactly the same, can show a massive swing in test scores, where the recognition tasks of select type items students can perform 30, 40, 50, 60% higher than if you have them generate everything from memory. So keep that in mind when you are trying to get a good handle on what students can actually do by themselves in a real world situation. We're going to be talking about short answers and essays for those situations in which you really need the students to produce things, or you're looking for much more in-depth knowledge about how ideas are structured in students' heads. So we'll start with short answer items. And by short answer items, I mean items that can be answered with a simple word or phrase. If it goes beyond that, we're going to be talking about essays. And essays fall into two types, extended and restricted. Restricted is 1 to 3 sentences. Anything more than that, we're going to call an extended essay, but more on that later. The great thing about short answers is, like multiple choice, they're very flexible. And, they're easy to make, and we'll get to that in a minute. When we talk about different types or different levels of questions, right, it's the same as it was for multiple choice or anything else. I can do basic recall stuff where I use verbatim or word-for-word descriptions. I can focus on principles by talking about relationships, or I can focus on semantic meaning, or I should say, indicating that I am trying to make sure that the student has connected their knowledge to other knowledge. And I can do this again by having them fill in a word or a phrase, sometimes short definitions where they redescribe a put it in your own words kind of thing. Once you get to the sentence level of that, though, we are going to call those restricted essays. And then same thing for application, right? I give them a real world scenario and they just have to supply me with an answer, just like they did in multiple choice, only they don't have a real good chance at guessing right if they have no knowledge whatsoever. You see this a lot in math classes, right? This is the preferred format because you want students to be able to use the knowledge. When it comes to the pros and cons, the pros are that, one, they're easy to construct, and a lot of people choose this as their basic default go-to format, because you don't have to come up with a bunch of different items. The formatting is really easy and so on. You can also get rid of the guessing factor, and so you're measuring recall rather than recognition. And in real life, most of the time, we really want our students to be able to recall things, not just to recognize it, because it's not often where you need to think of the right information that a list of options are presented to you on a floating screen, in the middle of the woods or something like that. So that eliminates guessing, and they're flexible in that you can assess a variety of different objectives. The cons are that they're not so great for measuring complex learning objectives, although you can structure it this way, as you can with multiple choice and matching and things like that. It just takes a little more thought, and there's more problems that come up with it. In other words, if I want to see how students have organized things in their head, I really need to go with an essay and not really provide them a lot of structure. And when we talk about assessing critical thinking, I'm typically limited in my ability with these first 4 formats that we've talked about, short answer, multiple choice matching, and true false, at assessing how things are structured in their head. Because if I want to know whether students have that self-direction element of critical thinking, I really need to see whether or not they can do it by themselves. And even if I give them a recall task, like a series of short answer questions, the questions themselves provide structure, right? Unless I make them very short and ambiguous, but then I may as well go with an essay. The cons, are additional cons, are difficulties in scoring. You have to decide whether spelling counts, whether legibility counts, and then if spelling is off or the word is not exactly right, even though it's a correctly spelled word, I have to decide what I'm going to give credit to. Whereas, right, A, B, C, D in a multiple choice, it's one answer's right. And I don't have to worry about this. And what happens here is you don't think it'll take much time, but sometimes reading, especially if you have a bunch of words that are spelled the same or have difficult spellings, does it count if instead of like anti-establishment, some kid writes anti Estabrook or something like that, or anti-alias? It's kind of close, but they don't know the word. They might know the concept, but it's really hard to tell. And so what do you give credit to, right? So anti-establishment, what if they said anti-establish? Or anti-establish dumb, things that you will likely see in your life. You have to make those decisions, and then you have to be consistent. So it often requires some regrading once you come across some new words that kids have put in, and you kind of change your mind about the rule you were going with. The good news is that you only usually have to do that once or twice, and then after that you iron out all the wrinkles. Final thing is that you have the problem of multiple interpretations if you're not specific enough in what you want the answer to be. So, for example, right, I could ask the question of where was the ice cream sundae invented? Now, you could say Earth or our solar system. That's fair. It's correct. You could say America. That would be correct. You could say Wisconsin, and that could be correct unless you're from Ithaca, New York, in which you think it's invented there, or you're from some town in Indiana, which also lays claim to where it's invented. You could require the exact city, which would be Two Rivers, Wisconsin, where I'm from, and it's been kind of established that it was first invented there, and so we had this thing called Ice Creams Tuesday every summer, where we give out free ice cream sundaes to everybody. You get these little coupons and so on. A lot of fun. You could not just mean the city, you could mean the actual ice cream shop, right? And so the level of specificity is something that you need to think about beforehand. In social studies, if you're asking, right, for when something happened, do you mean the year, the month, the date, or the decade, or the century? Open to interpretation, so you have to specify that. So that gets us to our recommendations. First recommendation is that you've got to be really specific, again, with this ice cream sundae example. The second issue, or second recommendation, I should say, is don't take items word for word from the textbook. The reason is that oftentimes it's not really a standalone. It's also the case where the blanks don't necessarily fit within this whole specific question option. So like in this case, objective test items can be either blank or blank, supply or selection, right? You could say right or wrong. You could say poorly constructed or well constructed. I could, put a whole bunch of different words in there that would make sense and actually complete the sentence well. The better version is that objective test items such as multiple choice and alternative response are blank items, while short answer items are blank items. It creates more specificity, so there's only one answer, and it's more likely to remind the student exactly what we're talking about. When we talk about direct questions and incomplete statements, a lot of people like to put blanks in or put a blank at the end of a statement, right? You have to be specific with these, and it's usually easier just to write the question and not have a blank for them to write on because of how kids write differently. It's easier to format and so on. So again, for example, John Glenn made his first orbital flight around the Earth in, do you want a year? Do you want what kind of spaceship it was? His emotional state, right? Better, what did John Glenn make his first, or when did John Glenn make his first orbital flight around the Earth, specifying the year. Better, or best, is in what year did John Glenn make his first orbital flight around the Earth, right? Because now I'm specifying that I do want the year. Likewise, in math, if the answer is to be expressed in units, indicate the type of answer wanted. Do you want it in mixed format here, or are they supposed to just give you it in ounces, right? So give them blanks, give them structure, because it's going to make your grading time a lot faster. And if you're really trying to see whether or not they can do those conversions between ounces and pounds, that's going to get you that information too. They could go with a whole bunch of different units where they could start expressing things in grams, kilograms, ounces, pounds, troy ounces, right? Pennyweights, and so on. So be specific. Not that any kids would do this, and it won't cause you problems most of the time. But to make sure that it doesn't, it's good to think ahead. The next recommendation is that if you are going to use blanks, make sure that they're uniform in length and consistently placed. So pour, right? The length of the blank gives a clue to how long the word is going to be, or it can cause some reliability problems by not giving students enough space to write, which can be frustrating. A better version, right, would be making sure that the blank is of the exact same length and in the exact same place. A lot of times, too, it's better to just put them on the left and have a designated spot where all questions will be answered, because then you just have to look at that one side of the sheet rather than having just a blank area where students can be writing almost anywhere. And I've seen, even in these classes at the university level, a wide variety of what people do.